Hi, my name is Dorothea Dix, and this is my version of Draw My Life. I'm an educator, a mental illness advocate, and a humanitarian. However, before we get into all the things that I did in my adult life, let's start from the very beginning. I was born in Hampton, Maine in 1802, and my dad was a Methodist preacher, meaning he was never really around at home. Also, my mom suffered from depression, leaving me to tend to my younger siblings. When my dad happened to be home, he would drink a lot and be rather violent. However, he taught me how to read and write, a gift I will always be thankful for. So, when I was 12, I moved to Boston with my grandmother, who gave me a love for education. I started to have a love for teaching others when I was around 14, which is also when I moved again with my aunt to Massachusetts. In 1819, I then went back to Boston and founded a school especially for young girls called the Dix Mansion. While I was fortunate enough to have a wealthy grandmother to support my education, I wanted poor girls to learn as well. So, what did I do? Essentially, I founded a charity school where poor girls could attend for free. I would supply the textbooks and etc., which I did write myself. I soon fell ill at the age of 34 and was forced to stop teaching. When I was ill, my doctor suggested that I spend time in Europe to seek treatment. During this time, I was introduced to reformers who were interested in changing the sad conditions that people treated the mentally ill. I was so appalled to see them housed in horrible conditions with no heat, light, furniture, and barely any clothes. So, once I arrived back to America, I started touring mental institutions nationwide. I started reporting this criminal treatment to many politicians just for them to care and make a move. Many people, including politicians themselves, disagreed with my push for fair treatment to the mentally ill. So, I pushed harder and even further and more forward just to create institutions to grant them better conditions than in other hospitals, and to give them the better life that they deserve. I began establishing many institutions in North Carolina, Illinois, and New Jersey, just to name a few. During this time, I continued to try to pass legislation in hopes of making a national asylum. However, it didn't pass. But once the Civil War started, I focused on helping the Union, and I was the superintendent nurse, so it wasn't that bad after all. I was successful in my field in advancing the nurse's skills overall, and I was highly respected, just to note, for treating Confederate and Union soldiers alike. I used this opportunity to get more professional training for women nurses, and in 1865, I finished my position and started raising more money for social reforms. And in the endgame, this advocacy essentially helped gain support for the mentally ill throughout the country. So, in the years that followed, I traveled to hundreds and hundreds of prisons and workhouses across the United States, documenting the inhumane treatment that people with mental illness received, and reported my findings to state legislature. Furthermore, my work not only resulted in the establishment of 32 mental health hospitals in a wealth of U.S. states, but it also helped to change people's perceptions of mental illness and essentially destigmatize it. In my time, sadly, mental health disorders are not recognized as treatable conditions. Rather, they are perceived as a sign of madness, warranting imprisonment in merciless conditions. However, I did set out to change such notions and destroy the stigma associated with all forms of mental illness.
I was a prior coworker who worked with the late Dorothea Dix. My name was Horace Mann. Dorothea, Charles Summer, and I were named the Three Horsemen of Reform, due to gaining our support as well as a man named Gridley Howe. I met her through her friend Channing, who advised her to speak to me and other influential men in the community to get their public opinion on how the mentally ill were treated during our time. She then started visiting poorhouses, prisons, and towns to search for the mentally ill and how they were treated. Her findings ended up with her sadly seeing the mentally ill being chained to walls, locked in cages, and further mistreatment. With the support of me and many others, Dorothea Dix petition for the welfare of the mentally ill were approved which allowed her to gain a bill that allowed for funding for the mentally ill in the Worcester Hospital. After this, she expanded her campaign, which worked, allowing her to gain more funds all over the country to create her nationwide hospitals and other improvements towards helping the treatment of the mentally ill.
After the war, she briefly returned to her work on behalf of the mentally ill. She also raised funds for the National Monument to Deceased Soldiers at Fortress Monroe. Following the war, she resumed her crusade to improve the care of prisoners, the disabled, and the mentally ill. She contracted malaria in 1870 and was forced to abandon aggressive traveling, although she continued to write, lobbying for her causes. She took up residence at the hospital she had founded 40 years earlier in Trenton, New Jersey. Old hospitals were redesigned and rededicated according to her ideals, and new hospitals were founded in accordance with the principles I espoused. After a long life as an author, advocate, and agitator, Miss Dix passed away at the age of 85 in a New Jersey hospital. The hospital had also been established in her honor. She was buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Since Dorothea Dix's passing, mental illness and the treatment for mental health disorder came a long way. Currently, there are more than 800 psychiatric facilities as well as more than 6,100 mental health outpatient facilities in the U.S. In 1880, there were only 123 mental hospitals. This is a huge improvement. Dorothea Dix was one of the first in the United States to fight for healthcare as a basic right and a public responsibility to care for those in her nation who are mentally ill. She helped change the perception of the mentally ill patients among the people on all levels. Because of her work, it helped leaders and the public change their policies and perceptions to be more humane to the mentally ill as she shed a light on all the abuse and negligence to the situation. Overall, society needs more heroes like Dorothea to help change the perception and policies to enable all Americans with mental illness to live their life fully, just like every other person. She helped give nationwide treatment to the mentally ill from her time, and her influence poured into now.